Us tonight. My name is Vanessa Gauthier Vela. I am a postdoctoral fellow here in international relations at the DA, and I am absolutely delighted to be here tonight with Roxana. So I will present you our guest for tonight, then she will present you her research, and we're going to have a Q&A to finish the evening. So Roxana-Claudia Tompea is an ARC laureate and a PhD scholar at the Planetary Health Equity Hothouse within the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the Australian National University. She is also one of our very own DA graduates, as she finished in the MAIS program in 2020. At the Australian National University, her research investigates regulatory frameworks to combat greenwashing in the food sector with a focus on ultra-processed foods. Since 2020, Roxana has worked with the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, focusing on advancing circular economy principles in industry. Building on this experience, her research explored the commercial determinant of health in food systems, particularly focusing on corporate influence over health and sustainability narrative. Please welcome Roxana.
Thank you so much for this lovely introduction. It's such a pleasure and a privilege to be back at the DA after only 5 years, and to be able to share my research and the things that I'm passionate about with so many friends and colleagues of the DA. Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's such a nice way that you decided to spend your evening tuning in and engaging in a conversation about environmental sustainability, food regulation, and greenwashing. So on my part, I hope to make this conversation as engaging and interesting as possible, and I very much look forward to your questions, comments, and feedback afterwards. So let's kick it off. I'd like to start off with the triple challenge that humanity is facing today: climate change, social inequity, and poor health. Now, to this date, governance approaches have failed to prevent these issues. And in many cases, they have made things worse. So what we do at the Planetary Health Equity Hothouse is we're trying to generate new ways to address these failings. Specifically, we're rethinking governance around planetary health equity. That is, the equitable enjoyment of good health for all in a stable Earth system. And we're doing that by having an interdisciplinary approach, or an interdisciplinary lens. We're linking politics, economics, public health, environment, and society to analyze and challenge the conceptogenic system, the economic and cultural system that promotes overconsumption, encourages unhealthy diets, and unsustainable production. So I'd like to delve into each of these three pillars and showcase why they're important in this triple challenge. And the first one is public health. And the situation is quite bleak. In 2022, over 40% of adult population globally, that is 2.5 billion people, were overweight. 16% were diagnosed with obesity. In 2024, children under the age of 5 were diagnosed as being overweight. That is 35 million of them. Fast forward until today, 2025, and obesity surpassed underweight as the most prevalent form of malnutrition. What this means is that currently, more people are overweight and obese rather than underweight. 1 in every 10 school-aged children or adolescents are at risk of life-threatening diseases due to their diets. And in Europe, things are just as bleak. Around 60% of adult Europeans and 1 in every 3 children are overweight or obese. And these problems are translated in issues such as heart diseases, cardiovascular diseases, stroke, and different forms of cancers. These are non-communicable diseases. chronic, long-term diseases that result from genetic, behavioral, physiological, and environmental factors. The major drivers for these non-communicable diseases are unhealthy diets, lack of physical activity, and also consumption of alcohol and tobacco. Non-communicable diseases also disproportionately affect those living in low and middle-income countries, where 75% of global NCD-related deaths occur. Poverty makes things worse for the same people. The vulnerable groups are exposed to more harms, they have limited access to care, and even when they do have access to that care, it is more expensive. So what that means is that people in low and middle income countries are getting sicker faster, and they die younger, rather than those with high socioeconomic status. And public health is also deeply linked with social equity or inequity. And this is where the social determinants of health come into play. These are non-medical factors that are influencing health outcomes. Where we're born, where we live, where we grow, work, our gender, our ethnicity, our race. Social determinants of health also encompass equity or inequity. And in this sphere, I like to make sure that equity is understood in terms of opportunities and not outcomes. So to focus on equity means to focus on increasing the access, the capacities or access that we have to necessities like foods. Equity is also promoted when unfairness is addressed in accessing these opportunities. And this is a big challenge because we need to understand not what, but how to do it, considering there is a huge concentration of economic and political power that is central in inequities in foods and not only. And from this side, what I'm most interested in within the research that I'm conducting as a PhD student at the Planetary Health Equity Hothouse are the commercial determinants of health. The practices, systems, and pathways that are associated with commercial actors and their actions. In a nutshell, they represent the conditions, the actions, or even the omissions of commercial actors that affect people's health, either positively or negatively. And here, as examples, we can think about business actions, we can think about changes in supply chains, labor conditions, research funding, lobbying, as well as preference shaping. They're also very much disproportionately affecting populations that are not profiting from products and practices that are causing harm, but they're very much bearing the brunt of these harms firsthand. And this leads us to the third pillar, which is the environmental one, an equally important one. And the biggest challenge and the biggest threat that we're facing today is, of course, climate change. Now, climate change, simply put, represents the long-term shifts in weather and temperature patterns in ways that are affecting the ecosystems that are supporting and sustaining life. Human activity is the main driver of climate change. Almost everything we do produces emissions and affects the nature around us. The consequences are quite stark: droughts, floods, rising sea levels, and so forth. We see them very close to home here in Vienna with record-breaking floods in 2024, record-breaking temperatures in June 2025, but also changing of seasons due to global warming. But things are not just isolated to the Austrian capital. They're not isolated to the European continent. These are global issues. And to better have a picture and a bird's eye view of these global issues with regards to the environment, a useful tool and lens to use are the planetary boundaries, 9 of them. And when it comes to updating these planetary boundaries and looking at the Lancet Commission report that was recently updated last month, we know now that 7 out of the 9 planetary boundaries have been breached. And a major contributor to that breach are the food systems. Our current food systems are creating 5 transboundary transgressions. They're causing 1/3 of the global greenhouse gas emissions. And it's no wonder considering the industrial aspect of our agriculture alone. What is more, the wealthiest 30% are really causing 70% of all food-related environmental harm. Now, if we were to make a shift in our global diets, we could prevent around 15 million deaths each year. But making that change is not easy. Less than 1% of the global population is in a position of making that change within a safe and just food environment. So where do we go from here, and what causes these problems? Simple answer is a system, the conceptogenic system, which is briefly understood as a complex web of institutions, commercial actors, activities, policies, and norms that continue to reward and incentivize the excessive production and consumption of fossil fuels-based goods and services, despite them having a negative impact on human health and the environment. Now, within this conceptogenic system, I position my research around transnational corporations or multinational corporations. These are important players in the food sector, and they're dominating the ultra-processed food component. Now, while ultra-processed foods are very deeply linked with health and equity, in recent years, we noticed that transnational corporations producing and selling them are also entering the environmental arena, portraying their products, practices, and businesses as being environmentally sound. And here is where issues such as greenwashing come to light. But before we delve into greenwashing, let me briefly synthesize what ultra-processed foods are and why do they matter for the purpose of this conversation. Now, ultra-processed foods as a concept was defined in 2009 by epidemiologist Carlos Monteiro, who noticed the rising level in obesity and diabetes in Brazil, despite household purchases of sugar and salt declining. So what he noticed was that there was a shift from traditional cooking methods towards industrial processing of foods. So he wanted to build a category that could highlight that displacement of traditional diets towards industrial food systems, but also underline their role in creating this obesity pandemic. And as a result of that, he built the NOVA classification system, which really tells us the extent and purpose of food processing. And in brief, this is what the NOVA classification system tells us. If we're going from left to right, we see 4 categories. The first one refers to unprocessed or minimally processed foods. Here we have fruits and vegetables, legumes, as well as nuts. The second category composes processed culinary ingredients, everything from honey to vinegar, salt, and sugar. These are condiments we use in our meals. The third group or category is processed foods. Here we see cured meats, cheeses, freshly baked breads, canned or bottled vegetables and fruits. Now the last category is the one that I would like you to focus on, the fourth, ultra-processed foods. Everything from carbonated sweetened drinks, fresh, ready-to-eat meals, breakfast cereals, confectionery, chocolate, gum, and so forth. In a nutshell, ultra-processed foods represent industrial formulations that are derived from foods. They're food-like products. And if we were to replicate them at home, we would find ourselves in an impossible situation because we wouldn't have the ingredients nor the conventional cooking skills or methods to replicate such foods. They usually have a long list of ingredients such as stabilizers, enhancers, flavorings, and so forth. And they're characterized by 3 main indicators. They're convenient, they're omnipresent, most of the time they're very accessible, and they're very affordable. The second point is that they're highly palatable. This means they're almost impossible to resist. They're good to taste, feel, smell, and touch. And last but not least, they're heavily marketed. And that marketing really shows in the way that we're consuming ultra-processed foods, both in terms of patterns as well as trends. So far, when it comes to ultra-processed foods, or in brief, UPF's consumption, we see that Europeans take almost 30% of their daily energy needs from UPFs. The lowest is in countries like Italy and Romania, and the highest is in countries like Sweden. What is more, ultra-processed foods are consistently linked to non-communicable diseases, what we heard before in the previous slides about obesity, diabetes, and different forms of cancer. They're also unequally distributed. And this is very evident when we're applying an equity lens and we're thinking about affordability and about prices. So how are ultra-processed foods connected to the environment? We know so far their connection to health, we see their connection to equity, but what happens when we also apply an environmental lens? And why do we see so many transnational food corporations positioning themselves in between people and the planet as brokers for sustainability? Well, the answer is very much the curse of this continuous growth path that we're on, and is very much reflected by the neoliberal capitalist society that we live in. To say that in brief, the food system that was designed post-Second World War to end famine through cheap and calorie-dense foods is now the one causing obesity, disease, inequality, and environmental harm. This is because it prioritizes profit while people and the planet are paying the price. This is what Stuart Gillespie is saying in his most recent book, The Food Fight, where he's describing the food systems as being something so inherent to life. Foods are life. However, our food systems are the ones that are killing us. And this is not different when we also apply a green lens to foods. So green foods are the space where we see the most ultra-processed foods. They're very much dominating the discourse and the green arena. 98% of confectionery producers, these are producers of chocolate, of gum, of candy, they know sustainability is key, both to their sourcing as well as to their growth. And growth is all they care about. The sustainable food sector is currently valued at over 120 billion US dollar, with a compound annual growth rate of around 7%. This is significant. And even when we look at subsectors associated with ultra-processed foods, such as the market for sustainable packaging, growth is also there. It's consistent and it's expected to provide and generate profits. So there's no wonder that we're seeing more and more corporations selling this imagery of greenness, of sustainability, of positive future. They're telling us what a sustainable generation looks like. They're telling us they're pioneering new approaches towards that. And they're not just leading the way, but they're defining what a sustainable future looks like. Make no mistake, there's no ambiguity with regards to that purpose. Their purpose is to generate profit. And this is why greenwashing comes through as such an important and systemic issue. When we're considering green products, we might have in mind one or two characteristics that have to do with the environment. But in reality, everything from production, from commodities and raw ingredients, all the way to the consumption of goods, their disposal, their recyclability, everything has an environmental footprint. And this is why understanding greenwashing matters. As a concept, greenwashing refers to the deception, false, or incomplete communication of environmental efforts by entities in order to persuade us, the public, that their practices, their products, and their industries are environmentally sound, even when they're not, when there's no evidence and when there's no transparency. They have this approach of caveat emptor, buyer beware. So they're communicating about an environmental effort, and it's up to the consumer to make sure that that commitment exists, to check, to compare, and so forth. And they very much fear the approach of caveat venditor, which is seller beware, the responsibility being placed on the seller. And responsibility is truly important in this space and context because it's almost always placed on the individuals. What we're being told and sold is this false equity narrative that anyone and everyone can make a sustainable choice, that we can choose and vote with our wallets. But this deeply ignores structural inequalities. What is more, it also sustains and legitimizes harmful products, practices, and producing industries, and it reinforces this consumptogenic system of overproduction and overconsumption. So what is the situation then in the European Union? Well, growth matters. Growth matters a lot, especially when it comes to sustainability. And it's driven by consumer awareness, by the platforms we're using, by the policies we're supporting. Over 20% of Europeans prioritize sustainability in their food right after price, taste, and nutrition. This is also very significant. Almost half of Europeans say that ceteris paribus, all other things being equal, they would go for a product that has an environmental label or an environmental credential. Despite that, 1 in 3 Europeans say that they did notice some greenwashing happening in the last 12 months. However, only 3% or less would know to distinguish between what is green and what is greenwashed. And there's no wonder why. 70% of Europeans really trust that both regulatory authorities, as well as producers and certifying bodies, they do their job to make sure that there is no greenwash happening. Everything is green, and it's true. So I'd like to use that as a platform to present some of the environmental claims and greenwashing risks that probably many of us have encountered in our daily lives when we're going and are doing our food shopping. And the first example is the recyclability narrative, which is also a very common one. Now, recyclability is a top 5 greenwashing theme alongside offsets, net zero, environmentally friendliness, and so on. What recyclability tells us, or what it provides us, is with a false solution that that recyclability can solve the plastic or the climate crisis. In reality, however, we cannot recycle plastic indefinitely in an infinite loop. Recyclability and recycled products are also problematic when considering food due to the nature of food safety. So we have to bear in mind food contamination, be it physical, chemical, or biological. And because of that, 100% recyclability never actually exists. Today, in 2025, at the EU level, the way that we're recycling our PET plastic bottles is at 55%. Out of that, around 30% of the bottles actually become new bottles. And this is a stark contrast if we're thinking that globally, less than 10% of plastic is being recycled. So what do we do at the EU level when we have such narratives continuously challenging us all around? The European Consumer Protection Organization, BUC, decided to raise a complaint alongside members such as Client Earth with the European consumer authorities challenging this 100% recyclability narrative. And it did so by tackling the major bottle producers it could. And this all happened in November 2023. As of May 2025, one of these large producers acknowledged towards the European Commission that indeed they were misleading consumers about their recyclability and that they're going to do some small changes in their labeling systems. And here is the change. If you haven't noticed it, it's because it's right here in a small asterisk saying that accepts caps and labels. So we can have 100% recyclability without caps and labels. Now, is greenwashing then solved? BUC says no. Small print and vague rewarding still misleads consumers. And this is a proof that the current regulation that we have in place is weak, especially in terms of enforcement, while the companies know and they very much take advantage of the interpretive loopholes that exist within regulation. And they decided not to leave things as they are. So Client Earth, one of the partners in the initial complaint, continued on that path and initiated a court case, this time in Poland and against another bottle producer, a giant bottle producer, hoping to set a precedent that it matters to correctly interpret the law on consumer protection when it comes to 100% recyclability. And this has just been initiated a few weeks ago. Now, what the recyclability narrative is telling us is that sustainability narratives are often distracting us from the systemic drivers of inequality as well as climate change and pollution. They're placing more and more responsibility on the consumers, and they're legitimizing the production of these types of products. So curious about these kinds of examples, I wanted within my research to have a bird's eye view of how greenwashing manifests, but also what kind of varieties exist. So what I'm currently working on is a greenwashing framework that can be used in foods, specifically ultra-processed foods, to analyze and challenge some of these environmental practices. And so far, what we've come across is the fact that there are 3 levels of greenwashing. It can be at the product level, it can be at the process level, or the producer. Greenwashing can also be internal or external, and this matters deeply when we're considering transnational corporations. They have complex supply chains, they're working with lots of intermediates, with farmers, with auditors, with transporters, with retailers, and so forth. Greenwashing also has 4 primary facets. It can be about deception, it can be about falsehood, selectivity, or omission. And when it comes to causes, the predominant ones seem to be lack of due diligence, pressure to conform, competitive advantage, and data practices. But these are not all the characteristics that we can apply to understand greenwashing. We also take into consideration that greenwashing can be claims-based, that is everything that is textual, as well as executional. And here we're thinking about symbols, about imagery, about colors, which are all very, very subtle. As well, when it comes to litigation and addressing greenwashing from a regulatory perspective, intent comes about quite often. Does it matter if it's intentional or inadvertent, especially when we want to curb greenwashing overall? And I'd like to use this framework now to present a concrete case where this can be applied. So we have here a transnational corporation that owns an international brand that produces a very popular type of chocolate wafer. And what we can see here is a potential greenwashing risk happening at the product level. We have here 100% sustainably sourced cocoa. Now this is false. The supply chain for cocoa is so complex and full of stakeholders that individually have to be assessed as being sustainable. And here we're talking about labor practices, slavery, child slavery and child labor. We're talking about soil management and potential soil erosion. We're talking also about deforestation. Each and every one has to be sustainable in order for the supply chain to be sustainable, which presently, unfortunately, we cannot guarantee. Another type of greenwashing risk happens at the process level. So we have the ingredients, we put the product together, and then we have the packaging. What companies often tell us is that some of it is recyclable or contains recycled materials. But this is omitting the fact that only parts of the packaging are recyclable. And when it comes to food, recyclable plastic can actually be detrimental to human health and safety. So we need a lot of virgin plastic to complement it. Last but not least, we have potential greenwashing risks happening at the producer level. So this is the brand per se. This has nothing to do with the product, nor how it was made, but we see that the company wants to make a change when it comes to the environment. So it tells us it wants to have more trees planted. And this is the front of pack labeling. On the back, unfortunately, I don't have the picture available, but on the back it says that it's planting 1 million trees in Côte d'Ivoire. Now, both of these are problematic. One is deception and the other one is vagueness, because they really distract us from the polluting and extractive nature of the chocolate production system. But they're also lacking the data to prove how planting trees is offsetting this toxic business method. And apart from that, we also have sub-pockets of executional greenwashing. This is the imageries we see, like the green leaves, the earthy tones, and also the presence of logos, like the cocoa plan, which the company itself created, but also third-party certification systems like the Rainforest Alliance. These are all visual cues that imply sustainability without proper evidence. And this is just one small example of how greenwashing, in a pernicious way, engages within our foods and our food systems. And from that, I'd like to jump now to the regulatory approaches that we have potentially or practically to address greenwashing. So we know that in the European Union, greenwashing is a problem, and we have patterns and statistics to prove that. Over half of green claims in the EU are found to be vague, misleading, or lacking, and 40% are lacking supporting evidence. And this is quite stark considering over 230 sustainability labels exist across the union, and they have major transparency issues. Half of the green labels we have across the union have weak or no verification system in place. This means we have no idea how to assess the greenness of a product. But when it comes to regulation, there are a lot of avenues and pathways to address the problem. So far, the European Union has been praised for having the strongest sustainability regulation in the world. And it also has pretty ambitious initiatives. Two of them that are more or less targeting greenwashing are the Empowering Consumers for Green Transition Directive and the Green Claims Directive. The first one is about consumers having access to harmonized information so they know how to reuse and recycle their products. This is not specific to the food sector, but is still relevant for greenwashing. And this will enter into force in March next year, with the rules being transposed throughout the EU member states from September onwards. The second type of regulation that we have across the Union is the Green Claims Directive, or the Greenwashing Directive. Now, this is a very ambitious initiative. It wanted to make sure that companies prepare and verify their claims ex ante or a priori. So even before making any claim, they have to be sure that it's properly checked and verified. Unfortunately, the Green Claims Directive is currently held. It sits with the European Council and the European Parliament, potentially indefinitely. So we don't have these pieces of regulation yet. What we actually have instead is the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive, which is still a key legal tool that can be used against greenwashing. However, enforcement is very different depending on the EU member states. So to recap a bit of what kind of regulatory tools we have across the Union, we know that the first one is about consumer protection, and the second is about fair or unfair commercial practices. Consumer protection provides a very strong legal avenue for citizens as well as non-governmental or non-profit organizations to really challenge misleading claims, including environmental ones. However, the requirements under consumer protection law have this subversive nature or dimension. Claims really have to be false to be able to be litigated in court. So this also does really little to ban harmful industries from promoting themselves. And this is the reason why we see so many fossil fuel companies saying they're green, just because, apart from business as usual practices, they're also investing in renewable energy sources. Consumer protection law is also enforcing this individual approach, reactionary and responsive to the problem, which doesn't really address the structural issues or the cumulative changes that we need to challenge the systemic harm. When it comes to the fair or unfair commercial practices regulation, we see here there is potential to govern misleading claims, advertising, and unfair competition. And this can be beautifully complemented by audiovisual advertising laws. So we can ban and restrict advertising of harmful industries to vulnerable population groups such as youngsters and children. It's sufficient in principle to address greenwashing, but collective enforcement is still very weak. And this is because of the legal interpretation of the rules. The rules are not really interpreted to the extent that they were designed for. So that brought me into the position of asking, how is regulation differing across EU member states, and does it matter that we have different approaches to it with regards to greenwashing and to ultra-processed foods? So as a result came this very beautiful table where it was important to know what kind of ultra-processed foods are dominating EU markets. And no surprise there, it's confectionery. So products that are based on sugar, candy, gum, and chocolates are the type of ultra-processed foods that Europeans consume the most. So when taking that into consideration and controlling from some pertinent variables such as gross domestic product and purchasing power parity, we come to realize that Bulgarians are the ones that spend most of their income on confectionery and ultra-processed foods. In the middle, as a median, we have Romanians, and at the bottom, Italians, who spend least of their income on ultra-processed foods. And this is very much reflective on the health side, where the health profiles of the countries as provided by the OECD tell us that poor diets are the major contributor to mortality rates in Bulgaria at 29%, Romania at 25%, and second in Italy at 15%, right after tobacco consumption. So we know we have consumption of ultra-processed foods, we know where it's high, where it's median and low, we also know the health implications of that. What is the regulatory landscape telling us though? Well, so far in terms of regulation, the 4,008 pieces of regulation that I was able to identify and briefly analyze, they're telling us very different stories. When it comes to regulation that covers food safety, environmental sustainability, consumer protection, and commercial practices, Italy dominates the sphere. almost 2,000 pieces of legislation are around food safety, including provenance of origin, labeling and packaging, and so forth. So Italians are the strongest when it comes to food regulation. They also have this approach of command and control. So it's everything about top-down, mandatory, hard law. In the middle, we have Romania, where we have a medium share of ultra-processed foods, a weaker oversight, and a balanced approach between mandatory regulation and voluntary regulation. This means that we have principles like polluter pays, which is command and control, but we also have voluntary opportunities for companies to invest in voluntary labels and showcase their environmental efforts on the Romanian markets. We also have a very nice balance between consumer protection and commercial practices. Last but not least, in Bulgaria, we see there's a high penetration of ultra-processed foods, less regulatory capacity, and regulation that is focused on command and control, hard law, that protects the consumers rather than make sure that commercial practices are fair and just. So that is the regulatory landscape so far, and please bear in mind this is an ongoing research, so it still has a lot of different pockets and perspectives to build around. But before I conclude the presentation, I'd like to bring forward some of limits and considerations that are worth for the discussion we're having tonight. And these are not necessarily related to the case study countries, but they're related to our relationship with foods and our relationship with sustainability. And a good way to see that kind of relationship is through marketing and marketing practices. Now, when it comes to marketing, Kemper and Ballantyne are telling us it cannot be sustainable. Marketing can never be sustainable because its sole purpose is to create, maintain, and enhance a continuous relationship of production and consumption. However, we can appreciate what marketing is doing to our sustainability systems, including in foods, by having 3 layers. So the first one is auxiliary. This integrates environmental and social aspects into the existing market systems. And this is quite relevant when we're considering that we have indicators for CO2 emissions, water efficiency, resource use, and so forth. But auxiliary sustainability marketing does nothing to challenge overconsumption. The second type or form is reformative. It reshapes production and consumption systems, but still within the regulatory and market limits. This wants to encourage behavioral change and responsible consumption, but very much operates within the same capitalist market logic. So it seeks gradual reform. And then comes in the third type, transformative, which is the radical approach. It fundamentally redefines marketing and economic priorities towards ecological limits and social justice. Here we see true concepts emerging such as self-sufficiency, degrowth, exnovation, and well-being. So these are some of the aspects that are worth considering when we see our relationship to foods through marketing, but also our relationship with sustainability through the same lens. Another consideration worth introducing within the conversation we're having today is the concerns around regulatory instruments that we're having, and some of them revolve around consumer-based law. And Christine Parker, a professor of law at the University of Melbourne, who's also actively working on greenwashing, is telling us that given sufficient, meaningful information about environmental credentials, consumer law can really be elevated to climate-conscious consumerism. However, this does nothing to challenge the climate crisis because it does not regulate the systems of unsustainable production and consumption in the collective interest. What consumer law does instead is that it promotes good consumers or smart consumers that might consume smarter but not necessarily fewer. And here we have a bit of Peter's principle where when something is working well, it's rewarded with so much that it changes the purpose for which it was built in the first place. And with that in mind, I'd like to conclude the presentation today by restating that currently our food systems and the way in which we're consuming ultra-processed foods are really breaching health, equity, and planetary boundaries. And greenwashing is very much part of that problem. It sustains harmful products, practices, and producing industries. And this is clear because we have so many varieties of greenwashing, most of which cannot be litigated currently. EU regulation is quite strong and shows great potential in this sphere, especially when we're considering consumer law and commercial law. But it has its limitations, especially when we're taking things to the systemic level and when we're considering enforcement. And this is a case illustrated very well when we're considering the narrative of 100% sustainability. Opportunities still do not fall short. We can still improve very much the rules that we have in place, and we can increase the enforcement as well as ensure consistency throughout the EU member states. And regulatory independence is something that we should always seek to foster, especially independence from political and corporate capture. In the same note, it is important to raise capacity, to generate, but also to continuously verify evidence. And this is done through expanding legal definitions such as the one provided for greenwashing in a way that vagueness, deception, and selectivity can also be captured and encapsulated. Only by doing so, we can truly move beyond consumer-centered tools to really retransform our food systems and challenge the consumptogenic system. And this can be beautifully done by applying a planetary health equity lens, reforming regulation in a way that works for the people and the planet. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Roxana, for this fascinating presentation. A very contemporary subject that links together climate change, public health, but also issues of marketing and communication processes, as well as regulation on different level. So I am very curious to hear you all. We're gonna now open the Q&A section. Please present yourself before every question and keep your question very brief because of time issues. If I may, I would like to ask you a question. I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions together and then let our guests answer. So I would like you talk to us about corporations, but I would like, if it's possible, to hear you about their own agency. How do they organize around this idea of greenwashing? Is there some idea, because you're talking about it as a mode of persuasion, communication, so are some ideas traveling transnationally? Is there some organization to push back those regulations? I would be very curious to hear more about this. So please, I'm gonna go like this, please. Oh, we have a microphone, sorry.
Thank you, Ms. Tompea, for the very interesting and interdisciplinary presentation. So my question has to do with environmental racism. So you were talking about, the intersection between public health, social inequity, and environmental issues. And I'm reflecting on, not just food deserts, which I think is a very well-known cases of environmental racism, but for example, in the US, how Nestle seizes public water and land. But I was wondering if there's any other examples that are really impactful to you that you've come across during your research. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, another, yes, here. Did you? Yep. Yeah. Keep the microphone.
All right.
Can you present yourself, please?
Yes. My name is Kim Bergloff. Thank you so much for your presentation so far. In a similar vein to the previous question, I would like to know, do you think that developing countries are more vulnerable to imported greenwashing narratives, especially when they come attached with green growth funding and aid packages?
Thank you. The floor is yours.
Wow,
please, Roxana.
Thank you so much for your questions. I'm so glad they're not challenging. You really started soft on me. But I'll try to be brief and hopefully useful in what I've come across so far in this ongoing research. I think I need to specify it's still an ongoing project. So the first question was about corporate agency with regards to greenwashing and persuasion and traveling. To answer briefly, it depends who you ask. So in my current role, I'm conducting fieldwork across different EU countries right now. I'm speaking to experts, to industry representatives, to regulators. And depending who you ask, the answer changes. The industry says it's suffering from greenwashing. And it's suffering so because transnational corporations, these are the main topic or the main category of actors that I'm interested in exploring. They have extreme rigid responsibilities with regards to their shareholders. So the financialization of the food sector and how food is not a human right and a human need, but is actually a commodity, is very much reflected in the behavior of these companies. Most of them are also publicly listed, which means that they're responding to shareholder demands, and they also want to make sure that they're staying relevant and they're generating profit. And because of that, court cases like the ones I was trying to briefly mention, they're so few of them, but these court cases are really scaring the industry in the sense of they're pushing back on their communication, being more on the prevention side and more on the cynical part. So greenwashing seems to be affecting different types of actors as we see it, but the bigger question and the important question is, what is the worthiness, what is the value of greenwashing when we compare it to the worthiness and the value of being portrayed as green? And what we see so far and what the data is showing us is that it really matters. It generates profit, great reputation, and a sense of responsibility that people really want to engage with. And these brands are so well equipped to creating that continuous relationship we have with our products. So that would be in brief my answer to that. With regards to environmental racism and food deserts, I don't have specific examples right now in mind, but because you mentioned Nestle, and I remember so starkly this interview that took place with the former Nestle CEO. I think he was also Austrian, not to create any tensions right now, but he was talking about water, as you said, and he was saying that water is a private good. Otherwise, how would people know it's valuable and important if we don't put a price on it? So that really puts things in perspective of how we value things that are so essential to sustaining life, human life, but also in the natural world, right? And the third question, I think it was about developing countries and how they're impacted about greenwashing. We see different types of layers and different types of harms. Some of the most common examples in low and middle income countries is with regards to packaging. So many products are individually packaged there because people cannot afford large sets or packages. So the containers are minimized and there's a lot of plastic happening. On a second part, they're also importing a lot of the waste and everything that is coming from the West. So they have this double burden. Plus regulation comes through. They cannot really afford investing in regulation when they're in the survival mode. So this really accentuates the burdens that we see with people, both in terms of environment, but also in terms of equity and the access they have.
Thank you. I'll take 3 other questions. Please, Mr. Here, then we'll go back there.
Thank you very much. My name is Branko Bošnjaković. I used to be a titular professor of environmental management and also regional advisor on environment at the United Nations Economic Commission of Europe. Thank you very much for your most interesting and most, informative presentation. And I have a question. Why you reduced yourself, limited yourself to European Union? Because, of course, there are other continents. And is this limitation or concentration due to more consciousness of environmental matters in Europe? Is it a question, public consciousness and policy maker consciousness, and more enforcement of rules? And many other, there could be some other reasons, but it would be most interesting to hear what is the case, what is happening in other continents. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to bring back the microphone there, please. One of those 2.
Whoever you chose.
Yeah, the lady. Nicholas.
Sorry, wasn't it me? Okay, never mind.
All of you are going to ask questions.
Thank you, Ms. Tompea. My name is Nicholas Gebhardt. I'm a MIS2 student here with with a background in economics. My question would be regarding, we focused a lot on Europe, and Europe has very strong regulation about all this. But I have a data question now. If Europe would actually stop tomorrow with all of these bad consequences and all of these bad actions, how much would we actually reduce CO2 emissions in that sense? Thank you.
Thank you. And in front.
Thank you. My name is Emma Jagar. I'm also a student here at the Diplomatic Academy. And I actually do want to know more about Europe. So you said, my question is about equity in regulation, because you said there were different approaches across the EU members. Are there ways that regulatory frameworks can avoid further disadvantaging small-scale producers that are more local in terms of distribution or sustainability certifications, since they often compete with large-scale producers and they can struggle with that especially, and they are vital for preserving local food systems? Thank you.
Thank you.
All excellent questions. So thank you so much for your question, Branko, and also for bringing this idea of public consciousness and consumer demand into this discussion. So why limiting to the European Union? At first, I started off quite broad, and I was interested in exploring a comparative situation between Australia and the EU. And the reason why I was thinking about the EU is because it is a leader in sustainability. When it comes to regulation and when it comes to things that have a ripple effect, the EU is the first place to look at. And this is all on different sectors, as in technology, as in industry, as in also in foods. And the reason for that is that we actually have very concerned consumers. Consumers are demanding more, and we see that more and more with the younger generations, that they're more aware, but they're also more vulnerable and exposed to how marketing and commercial practices take place because of how everything is portrayed as an option or a solution, when in reality we don't have enough evidence to support those claims. So it was interesting to me then to shift towards the European Union, and also it was important to limit the research to make it consistent, cohesive, and also pertinent to see exactly what a good regulatory approach could be envisioned and could look like. The European Union matters because we have a lot of environmental labels and claims. They're unfounded, they're vague, they're misleading. We also have problems with the way in which we're consuming foods, especially unhealthy foods like ultra-processed foods. And we also have some of the largest transnational corporations headquartered here, especially when we're thinking about confectionery. So even though these corporations are selling products everywhere around the globe, if they have to abide by EU laws, most likely they will have to change their business models and practices elsewhere just because of the costs of those changes. So the EU has this great opportunity to create a ripple effect and improve environmental sustainability when it comes to regulation in other places as well, just because of the demands here. Now, on the opposite side, as a threat or as a risk, what I'm hearing a lot from the industry is that because of the dense bureaucratic regulation, the EU in some parts is becoming unattractive, especially when we're looking at industries such as confectionery and cocoa production. Cocoa is coming from around 5 million small farm holders, most of them being based in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. They produce their cocoa in the same way. However, when they have to export it to the EU, there's a huge pile of documentation that they have to abide by. Everywhere else, it's more simplified. So for them, it's an extra burden, and they don't really see the point of that, considering the labor conditions and the infrastructure around that is the same. So it's kind of a double-sided sword, if you wish. The second question was about if the EU stops the bad consequences. Is the bad consequences in terms of this drive towards sustainability?
What would that have? Would that have an impact, or how would that end up?
Oh, that's such an interesting question, isn't it? And this is exactly what the corporations don't want us to do. Instead of changing our consumption patterns, our consumption behaviors, they just want us to make small incremental changes. So we're recycling more, maybe we're buying less, but we're still buying those products. And what an interdisciplinary approach, so having different lenses, different disciplines come together, what this helps us see through is that if we reconsider the purpose of foods and how we engage with foods, maybe we don't need the products in the first place. That would be extremely detrimental to the businesses, but would it really affect us? Would it affect our health and our well-being? And this is why foods are such a complex, not complicated, but complex topic, because foods are never just foods. They have deep social, environmental, political, economic, and even entertaining capabilities, right? When we're thinking about the entertainment industry and how foods are portrayed in terms of competition, in terms of mastering different types of cooking skills and so forth. So foods are everywhere and they're part of that discourse. If the Europeans would stop, would others continue in the same way, in the same path? I'm not sure. I would hope so. But it doesn't have to be Europe the one that leads, because we have so many different cultures that are treating foods differently. And we have so much to learn from other regions and other places, and also from other communities, especially indigenous communities. And having the privilege of doing this research in Australia really allowed me to see how much it matters to have that family-based individual, and also sometimes even like indigenous approach to food, that we don't seeing it as a commodity, but we're seeing it as something nurturing and something also environmentally friendly. And the last question, if I'm not mistaken, was about equity, regulation, and SMEs. So SMEs are quite interesting because they really dominate the food sphere when we're thinking about the EU. We have so many micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, and they're really struggling to compete on this environmental front with the large food corporations. And the reason why that happens is because they don't have the resources, they don't have the staffing, and they don't have the capacity to build on those ESGs, those environment, social governance reports. Transnational food corporations, they're leading the way. And because of that, they're also defining the rules. They have the resources, they have the consultancies, they have the experts, and the experts will shift the rules and the methods and the measurements in ways that are presenting those efforts as environmentally sound. SMEs don't have that. And because of that, the regulatory regime, the regulatory aspect has to come forth and support them. What the European Commission is telling us that it's doing is that precisely it puts SMEs at the center of every single policy and directive. And this is the case with the Greenwashing Directive, the EU Green Claims Directive. It wanted to exempt SMEs from those voluntary commitments because it knows it's so hard to compete on the green market with the large global players. How will that turn out? It's still a question that needs to be answered. Unfortunately, for now, that directive is being halted. There's so many political pressures around it from the European Parliament, from the Commission. The industry also is quite interesting. What I've heard in different conversation is that transnational corporations want the EU Green Claims Directive to take place because they already have so many verification systems. They're already collaborating with so many certifying bodies, so many environmental auditors. So they already have everything in place, and they want to make sure they can communicate about that. So it's another avenue then to increase marketing and advertising. Will this happen or not? Well, fingers crossed, I do hope so, but it remains to be seen.
Thank you. We can take another round of questions. Yes, first here.
Hi, my name is Strahinja Kiselčić. I'm also a student at DA. I have a question. Isn't the push for sustainable UPFs mostly a strategy of global north corporations to greenwash their continued exploitation of global south resources and people? And on that note, how do we make sustainability regulation global without reproducing neo-colonial food politics? Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to go over there. Please, the person at the fourth row.
Thank you. My name is Sarah Janine. I'm also a MICE2 student with a medical and public health background. So I have two questions. There is growing evidence that green and eco-friendly labels create a health halo and mislead consumers that sustainable products are also more healthy, even though they're ultra-processed. So my question would be how policymakers can address this overlap between health and sustainability messaging. And my second question, since in the EU now until now there is no harmonized front of pack labeling, neither for nutrition nor environmental impact, if you believe that this creates a momentum now for a combined label and what the obstacles to a combined label could be.
Thank you. And a third one over there.
Hello, yes, thank you for the presentation. My name is Christopher Itzia1. My question is, have you identified any type of technology gaps and or limitations in the supply chain? You've mentioned a lot about what industries want and are acceptable, but they're quite limited to also what's feasible technologically. Is this factored in? On a follow-up on one of the things you said earlier, if there's time, you mentioned food as a right. How would that actually be implemented and work out, especially in considerations of those who are then growing and making the food?
Thank you very much.
Oh, great questions, all of these. So let's start off with sustainable ultra-processed foods. Do they actually exist? Probably not. Not to my knowledge, at least. And again, I'm an emerging scholar in the field, but what we do see is that there's a great opportunity to present them as environmentally sustainable. And we see this a lot in products that are alternatives to meat and alternatives to dairy. So here, these types of ultra-processed foods are coming strong, saying they're good for the planet, they're good for the environment. And they're very much against the conventional ways, the industrialized way in which we produce meat as well as dairy products. There is a huge and very relevant tension here because these foods are not necessarily good for human health. The list of ingredients, the type of processing is just as dense and as complicated. So how do we balance environmental priorities with public health ones? And this, for now, it is an individual choice and an individual question. When we're considering green and eco labels and this halo effect, if I remember right, what comes to mind is how fast the system and the field is changing and how dynamic it is. And perhaps in the last 2 years or so, we saw the emergence of GLP-1-like products, so glucagon-like products that are limiting our desire to eat more, to consume more, right? So they're for people who wish to tackle overweight and obesity issues. And because of that, a lot of transnational food corporations are now investing into ultra-processed foods that have increased micro and macronutrient profiles. So we have dairy products, for instance, that have now more proteins and more fiber just because they want to compete into a field that is not yet regulated or well-defined. When it comes to front of pack or back of pack labeling, in the European Union, a voluntary labeling system was the Nutri-Score. And it took so many resources, time, and pressure from the regulators to convince the industry to accept the Nutri-Score. So we have letters from A onwards, which is represented in green, all the way to red. And this is something that in Australia, for instance, they have the 5-star credit system because they didn't like the traffic light, they didn't like colors, they thought it was too strong, they thought consumers would choose to avoid those products that are not marked in green. It's still voluntary. A lot of corporations choose to use it only on some products, and after a few years of rolling up, they realize it's not that well working out, so they're now dismissing it. We don't have any alternative for that, and that's only related to the health aspect. We don't have anything on the environment. Can we combine the two? I would say not yet, not until we figure out what really works. But still, there are a lot of lessons learned into what industry likes and also what industry fears. And last but not least, with regards to technology and limitations, you made me think of a recent book that was published by Jennifer Clapp on the titans of the agricultural industry. And she's exploring this in Northern America and Canada, but it's very relevant worldwide to see that the global players, and in this case is the companies that are producing seeds, fertilizers, pesticides, and machineries, they are the ones that also capitalize on technology. And here, technology is not used to democratize the food system, but rather to have this capture, this corporate capture. So instead of innovating, we're contesting and we're building resistance rather than resilience. So it's a double-edged sword in that sense, because technology really has this potential of increasing environmental sustainability by monitoring, by verification and so forth. But if it is owned by specific industry players, then it will be only used for the purposes of those players. I think that would be it in brief.
Thank you. And I would open a last round of questions. We're going to go over there first. Yes, please.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm Nicole Jarin from ICE2. So a lot was talked about green initiatives like carbon labeling, eco-friendly certificates, or plant-based reformulations, which are often developed in the global north that have environmental standards that are way higher. However, as we saw with the KitKat labels, UPF supply changed from raw ingredients like soy, palm oil, cocoa, sugar, to packaging are often based in the global south, where environmental regulations are weaker and production is way cheaper. My question is there any considerable focus from current green food initiatives in the EU to shifting population mindset to local markets and locally sourced foods as the way to move forward?
Thank you. I saw other hands here. Is it possible? Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Matthias Krieg from ETH, one business and economics background. My question is regarding whether, when we are setting focus on greenwashing, does that inflate the problem of, said, obesity or sustainability, instead of rather putting the focus on addressing responsibility and culture within countries? We also often speak about sustainability and about greenwashing, and I do believe it is a good thing, but does it necessarily change the culture of consumption within the country and address the lack of responsibility of those consuming?
Thank you. And the last one, please.
My name is Maren Gröning, and I see a very close complementary relation between processed or ultra-processed food and marketing and the design of the package and everything, which is not the unprocessed food. So I think it must be a very fundamental break with this system of industry and marketing of food as such.
Thank you very much for your questions. Related to green initiatives and green certificates and Global North, because I think you mentioned KitKat and other examples, this was something that was quite at hand to explore within the greenwashing framework. And there is an important question here in which path is more appropriate to take. Is it to challenge the current system and the current rules step by step, and then we have the risk of always being reactive, of having one-off resolutions, and then still playing by the same rules and keeping the same system in place? And that is the consumptogenic system of overconsumption, of overproduction, and so forth. Or do we take alternatives? And this is exactly where it's so important to reconsider what we have at hand, especially in different parts of the European Union. Do we have different approaches and cultures to food? We also have very specific religious or family-based kind of approaches to food. And there are a lot of initiatives and organizations, either food sovereignty organizations or food watch organizations, that are really promoting a degrowth approach. So instead of challenging the system by its own rules and perpetuating and promoting it as it is, we're really reconsidering the priorities of our food system. So we're trying to produce more locally, we're considering permaculture, we're considering so many of the traditional and native products that are available within our community. And because of that, we also have to reconsider our diets and what we prioritize. With relation to greenwashing and obesity, I think that was the question, as well as responsibility here. Well, responsibility is so important, isn't it? And unfortunately, what we see so much through regulation as well as through communication, and here I specify advertising on the industry side, is that responsibility actually hides lack of legitimacy or lack of autonomy, because placed on individuals, we're giving this false narrative, equity, environmental, or health-wise, that we actually choose. We have a variety of products to choose from, but those products are actually owned by a handful of companies. So they're kind of the same thing. Plus, we're not really making a deliberate choice. We're only exposed to what we have available. And when it comes to daily choices in regards to our foods, on average, we spend around 11 seconds in a supermarket before we pick up a product. That's not a lot of time to be responsible in the choices we make, and also long-term in what those choices represent. And coming back then to the industry and to the transnational corporations here, they know that very well. And that's why they're using a lot of the approaches we've seen in the past in the tobacco industry of what works, and they're using the same styles and the same strategies in foods. So they're connecting with populations and with groups at a very early stage. We see that in infant formulas and products designed for children that are not really about the product, but they're about the brand. And the brand stays the same. So throughout adulthood, you get so used to it, it creates a bond or a relationship that really fosters and legitimizes then the continuous use of that product, even though it's detrimental to human health. So greenwashing here can be used as another lens to appreciate that these products are not just bad for our health, they're not just inequitably distributed, but they're also causing a lot of environmental harm. And maybe we wouldn't know enough if they wouldn't be so eager to promote that environmental side of their businesses. And now that we know it, and now that we also have technology and data and evidence to showcase what works and what doesn't, it is a great momentum to address greenwashing, but in a way that is not reactive and one-off, but rather preventive. And last but not least, ultra-processed foods, marketing, and packaging. So this fundamental break that we can have from sustainability, if it's all right for you to write, Maren, because you mentioned that this fundamental break in the system we have. Ultra-processed foods are dependent on marketing. They wouldn't exist without it, because it's not really about the product. It really is about the brand. And as mentioned earlier, we have so intimate relationships with the foods that we're having every day and with the brands that we're seeing. And this is a bit of a frequency illusion, the Bade-Meinhof effect. We're seeing everywhere promoted, not just in social media through influencers, but also in sports activities and what they're sponsoring. So this very much legitimizes some brands, and it makes it okay to continue using them, even though they're abusing us. So it really prompts very difficult and very personal questions about what is important for us and also long term. And I think here's where the data that we are collecting so much, and the World Health Organization is doing an incredible job in showcasing that on non-communicable diseases. We see that long term, there are so many health impacts on the styles that we're having, on the diets that we're having. So this is a great opportunity to learn from those lessons and to make a change for us as well as for the generations that are yet to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much for enlightening us. Unfortunately, we have to stop the discussion here. Please join me in thanking Roxana for being with us today. Thank you for discussion, and thank you for being here. Have a good evening.
Thank you so much. That was